Next, I want to briefly run through Erector Spinae muscles with you guys. So these are not going to be tested on our lab exam. One, because I only have 30 minutes to set up, and I'm not going to spend the time digging through to find really deep muscles when we have a lot of good superficial examples. So big hint here, emphasize superficial muscles when you are studying. These things that we're talking about now will almost certainly show up on lecture, which is why I want to cover them, but I'm not going to ask you guys Erector Spinae on the lab exam. So we have 3 Erector Spinae muscles. From the name, erect the spine, we know that we're going to be extending the spine, or more accurately, we're going to extend the vertebral column. And I believe this is the saying Dr. Yard uses, I like spaghetti. This is what helped me to remember the order of the muscles. But basically from lateral to medial, we have ILS. I like spaghetti. So most laterally, we have our iliocostalis. If we break this word down, ilio is going to refer to the ilium, and costalis refers to the ribs. So this iliocostalis is closest to the kind of the ribs and the ilium. So let's just mark our ilium here and ribs. So this is going to be the most lateral muscle. And make sure you understand all 3 of these muscles are going to run from our occipital bone all the way down to the sacrum. So they're along the entire expanse of the vertebral column. The middle muscle is longissimus, so I don't have a great way to remember it other than that it's going to be in the middle of the other 2. And then spinalis is going to be that muscle closest to our vertebral column, or closest to our spine. So that is how I would remember it, closest to spine. So let's go ahead and draw that one in. So in pink, this would be our spinalis, and then in yellow, in between, we have longissimus. Yeah, this one's tricky to spell. And those are our Erector Spinae muscles. Okay. Lastly, we're going to talk about 3 more muscles, and that is it. So I have this image here showing some of the most important hip flexors of our body that nobody knows about. So hip flexors is a very popular term that gets thrown around. You know, people with desk jobs get stiff hip flexors, but they don't really know what that means or what muscle is involved in creating that stiffness. And so we have a term for 2 of these muscles. It is iliopsoas. These are going to be our most powerful hip flexors. Now we have to put an asterisk next to this because our iliopsoas are not really part of the axial musculature, but they are actually muscles crossing from the axial to the appendicular muscles. So they're kind of connecting the 2 regions, the 2 systems of the body. So there's actually 2 muscles here. We have our iliacus, and then we have our psoas major. And together they create our iliopsoas muscle. And so psoas major is going to be crossing from our axial to our appendicular skeleton. I'm going to outline it here in yellow. So it's this guy. It's going all the way from our lumbar vertebrae. And what's happening is there's this common insertion point onto the lesser trochanter of the femur. And that is common to all 3 of the muscles that we will talk about here. So this is going to be our psoas major. Iliacus is going to be the muscle lining our iliac fossa. So let's write that here. That's a memory cue. So it's going to line our fossa, and then it's going to do the same thing. It's going to run down here, join with our psoas major, and attach onto that lesser trochanter of the femur. And together, these 2 are going to have powerful hip flexion and lateral rotation of the hip. So let's write that here, hip flexion, lateral rotation of the hip. And then psoas major is also going to have the function of helping to flex our trunk. So in this case, it's going to help laterally flex our trunk, which makes sense if you think about the direction of the fibers. Starting to sound like a broken record here. We can laterally flex the trunk so the vertebrae go one way or the other, or as we proceed into the hip region, the level of the pelvis, that's going to get more into hip flexion and lateral rotation. Lastly, last muscle we will talk about today is Quadratus lumborum. So this name tells us something about the shape of the muscle and where we would find it and what it's going to act on. So it's going to be quadrangular in shape, and it's going to act on the lumbar region. And so let's look for that muscle here. It's going to attach along our lumbar vertebrae and then also along rib 12, which is this lowest rib here, that floating rib. And if we draw out the outline, you can see it does look quadrangular. So it's going all the way from rib 12 to our iliac crest. So there's another common attachment point of the iliac crest and the iliac fossa. And so when this muscle contracts, it's going to help extend our vertebral column, and it's also going to help abduct or laterally rotate it away from that midline. So it shares a function with that psoas major. This is another muscle where we can have bilateral contraction or we can have unilateral contraction, and you can try this on yourself. So when we bilaterally contract, we contract this muscle on both sides. That is what allows us to extend our lumbar vertebrae. When you arch your back, you're going to use the quadratus lumborum. Unilateral traction, contraction on just one side, is going to make this region go one way or the other away from that midline. Okay, so you probably noticed I didn't go over every single attachment point, every single action, because most of what you will be doing on the lab exam is identification. This is all good stuff to know for lecture. So lecture is very much going to be attachment points, insertions, actions, things like that. Questions about muscle groups, maybe some of those patterns we see, like common attachment points for muscles. In lab, that is all good information to know to inform you when you answer these questions. But what you will be doing is identification. So to wrap things up, let's talk about how to review for muscles. So I will always tell you, draw. It doesn't have to be pretty, but you can print out a skeleton. Some of what we'll do on the attendance sheets is going to be circling attachment points for muscles to try to get you guys to recognize some of those patterns. But drawing is going to help you recognize common attachment points. That is the most helpful way to learn muscle groups. Drawing or labeling. We want to practice that recall. For muscle actions, you can practice on yourself. You can practice with a family member or a friend. Call out a muscle action and you perform it. Or you can find an image online, kind of like we did with Skelly, where we've got muscle actions across many different joints. So that is one way you can practice. But I think the easiest way is probably going to be practicing on yourself. And as we will do in class, and definitely more with the appendicular skeleton, we're going to study different compartments and different views, not individual muscles. So it's super easy to get overwhelmed if you study one muscle at a time. So the best way to study is going to be to group things together and find those patterns, always looking for patterns here. And a lot of what we did today was that kind of pattern finding. So I hope you found this helpful. When we get to the appendicular skeleton on Friday, we're going to hit the ground running and do a lot of that practice identification. So good luck preparing for Friday.